sheltered
I
two
came to talk,
freezing
not
Apache
fight.
women. 3 days later, 30 Apaches surrounded his cabin. Marry one or both.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Utah Territory, winter 1877. Micah Shaw's ranch, elevation 7,000 feet, 4 miles from the nearest known trail. Micah had no reason to expect anything that morning. The cold had settled in for good. Snow was stacked past the third rail on the north fence. The wind kept sweeping low across the valley, and the sky hadn't changed color in 3 days. He rode out to check the trap line, same as always, moving slow through drifts deep enough to wear down the mare's front legs by noon. His bad legs stiffened early in the ride, made worse by the wind pushing east, but he didn't turn back. The traps were empty. Most animals had gone aground. He stopped once to patch a broken gate hinge with a rusted nail and a strip of wire, didn't bother swearing at it. When you live alone, you stop wasting words. By late afternoon, his breath was hanging heavy and slow. The light was beginning to fade. That's when he saw them, off to the right, behind the barn. At first he thought they were sacks. Something caught in the storm. He turned in the saddle, leaned forward, narrowed his eyes. 2 bodies. Human. No movement. He dropped from the mare, his boots landing stiff in the snow. He limped fast as the cold would let him. No voice came out. He didn't call to them. He didn't draw his rifle. They were women, lying half buried in the snow against the barn wall, one slumped across the other. No coats, just torn deerskin dresses pulled tight against the wind, their hair frozen into dark, tangled ropes across their cheeks and necks. He dropped to a knee. The one on top, older, leaner, had her arms slung over the smaller one's shoulders. Her eyes were shut, her jaw clenched tight. He touched her wrist with 2 fingers. She flinched, barely, still breathing. He stepped over them, lifted the smaller one first. She didn't weigh much. She was curled tight into herself, her skin ice cold. Her lips were cracked open like she tried to speak and failed. He didn't check her name, didn't ask anything. Just walked stiffly across the snow and kicked open the cabin door. Inside was dim. The stove had gone down to coals. He laid her down close, on the thick rug beside the hearth, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, then went back. The older one woke as he reached down again. Her eyes opened wide. She tried to push away, but didn't have the strength. Her breath came out sharp, defensive. Micah didn't meet her panic with words. He just said low, "You'll freeze." She didn't answer, but she didn't fight either. He carried her in the same way, shoulder against his chest, her braids stiff from the cold brushing the side of his neck. He didn't notice how close her legs were to turning blue until he reached the light. Her knees were scratched up raw, her dress torn low at the hem like she'd been crawling. He placed her beside her sister without saying more, then closed the door. Micah Shaw, 39, wasn't the kind of man who let strangers in. He hadn't spoken to anyone outside the trading post in over 6 months. He'd come west after burying his son and hadn't looked back. A war wound in his right leg had ended his time riding cattle. He worked alone now, bartering cured meat, hides, and trapline steel for beans, sugar, and nails. No visitors, no neighbors, and no letters. But now they were here, and they were dying. He grabbed his axe and started splitting kindling. His hands were fast. That was how he stayed steady, through labor, not emotion. He rebuilt the fire fast, let rise hot. The iron stove glowed red. He moved a kettle to boil water. Everything in the room warmed slow, but not enough. So he rolled out a second rug from under the cot and placed it closer to the heat, laid thick quilts over both women, and placed a tin cup of warm broth between them once the kettle steamed. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't ask what happened. He only said, "Drink when you can." The older one sat up an hour later, watched him from the corner of her, while he sat across the room, fixing a trap spring. Her arms were crossed under the blanket. She didn't shake anymore. She looked strong, but exhausted. Her face was narrow, high cheekboned, jaw firm, and her mouth was cracked from wind and exposure. Her eyes followed his hands. He didn't try to meet her gaze, didn't explain himself. He just kept working. The younger one didn't wake until night. She coughed and turned on her side, face twisted like it hurt to breathe. Her legs were twitching under the quilt. Her mouth moved silently. Then her hand slid out, searching. Micah rose, took the water from the edge of the stove, crouched beside her, and held the cup out slow. She blinked at him, then reached, fingers shaking hard. She took 3 sips before falling asleep again. It was almost midnight by the time the cabin finally felt warm. Micah sat with his back against the far wall, boots off, rifle within reach, coat hung on the nail beside the door. The wind outside never stopped, but the room held heat. They were safe for now. He didn't know how long they'd been out there, or what they were running from. But they hadn't come to take anything. They'd come because they had nowhere left to go. Micah rested his head against the log wall and let his eyes close, just for a minute. He didn't plan to sleep, but for the first time in a year, he didn't feel entirely alone in the room. The fire had burned down again by the time Micah woke. His shoulder ached from sleeping upright. The window panes were frosted over from the inside, and the light coming through was thin, gray, and quiet. Early morning cold that bit through everything, no matter how many layers you wore. He stood slow, knees stiff, back tight, leg dragging worse than usual. The kettle was dry. He refilled it with packed snow, set it back over the stove, and checked the woodpile. Low, not empty. It'd hold until midday. The 2 women were still asleep, or pretending to be. The older one, he hadn't asked her name, had shifted on her side, one arm under her head, the other resting near the younger girl's shoulder. Her breathing was even now, but her forehead creased like she was still bracing for something. The younger woman was curled up tighter, both hands clutching the quilt like she feared someone might take it back. Micah crouched near the stove, quietly poked at the coals until flame caught on a new log. He moved with care, avoiding the creak in the floorboard near the table. His mind had already turned to what needed doing. Break the ice off the well, haul more wood, check for animal sign near the root cellar. He glanced at the women once more, then pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The wind had shifted again. Tracks from yesterday were gone. No sign of the mare where he'd tied her near the corral. She'd wandered off, probably gone downhill, looking for dry grass. He whistled once. Nothing answered. He checked the barn. No new snow inside. Tools were where he left them. He grabbed the axe and started chopping. The sound echoed. Clean, sharp. It steadied his thoughts, gave him rhythm. By the time he returned inside with an armload of fresh kindling, the older sister was sitting upright. She didn't flinch this time. She watched him cross the room, eyes focused, alert but not hostile. Her posture had changed, more grounded now, less coiled. She wore one of his flannel shirts over her dress, sleeves rolled up roughly to her elbows. It hung loose on her frame, but she sat with her back straight, legs folded under her, hands still. "You feel steady enough to eat?" Micah asked. His voice came out even. She nodded once. He handed her a tin plate with bread and salted meat. Not hot, but enough. She didn't say thank you, but she accepted it without suspicion. He poured her a cup of weak coffee, then another for himself. Sat at the table. Waited. The younger woman woke 10 minutes later. She sat up slow, blinking against the light from the stove. Her hair was tangled badly. When she spoke, her voice cracked dry. "Where?" "You're safe," the older sister said. First words Micah had heard from her. Her accent was light, but her English clear. She turned her head slightly toward him. "This your place?" "It is," he said. "They call it Shaw's Bend. Not much of a bend anymore. Just me and a few traps." "You live alone?" He nodded. The younger girl drank carefully from the cup her sister handed over. She looked younger in the morning light. No more than 22, maybe 23. Her lip was swollen, cracked. Her cheeks were sunken. "What happened?" he asked. Not to interrogate. He just needed to know if trouble would follow. The older woman didn't speak at first. Then finally, "We left before dawn." "For days ago." "From where?" "Far south." She paused. "They said we'd be safer in the canyon." That was a lie. He didn't press. Whatever had happened between there and here wasn't something she'd say out loud. Not now. Maybe not ever. "You were outside almost 12 hours, he said. "If I come back after dark, you would not have made it." The younger one stared into her cup, fingers curled around it like it might vanish if she let go. "I'm Nara," the older one said. "She's Taya." Micah nodded once. Micah Shaw. They sat in silence for a few minutes. It wasn't heavy. It was just full of things that didn't need to be said right away. I'll patch the barn roof this afternoon, he said, standing. Snow's seeping through again. Stove gets too much draw when the wind hits wrong. If you're strong enough to help, fine. If not, rest. Nara stood slowly. We'll help. Taya looked nervous but didn't protest. Later, outside, the cold hit harder. Micah handed Nara a hammer and a tin of nails, then climbed onto the ladder himself. His limp made the climb slow. Nara stayed below, steadying the base. She didn't talk. She didn't watch him with suspicion anymore either. Inside, Taya swept the floor and folded their bedding. Her movements were careful. She paused often. Once, she found a loose thread on her hem and sat near the fire to sew it shut with a needle she found by the window. By nightfall, the roof was patched. The stove kept its heat better. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke, coffee, and wool. No one asked where they were going next. No one said they were staying. But when Micah rolled out a second bedroll and didn't mention giving it back, Nara nodded once in thanks. That was enough. The following morning came without warning. No sunrise, no birdsong, just the same pale curtain of light pressing through frost-stained windows, making everything inside look older than it was. Micah stirred early. His back ached from sleeping half upright again, and his right leg had stiffened through the night. He rolled his shoulder once, stretched slow, then sat still and listened. There was movement near the stove. Not loud, just a careful clink of metal and the rustle of fabric being folded. He looked over. Taya was crouched low, barefoot on the warm plank floor, wrapping leftover bread in a strip of wax cloth. Her face was cleaner than before. Her hair had been brushed out and rebraided, slung loose over one shoulder. She didn't notice him watching. Nara was already outside. He could hear the steady thump of the axe against the block. Rhythmic, precise. Micah stood without speaking, pulled his coat from the hook, and walked out into the yard. Nara didn't look up. She was focused on splitting kindling, her movements efficient. The sleeves of his old flannel were rolled high above her elbows, and her fingers gripped the axe handle like she'd been doing it since girlhood. The wood cracked clean under each stroke. He watched for a moment, then said plainly, "You swing too low. Angle the blade forward or you'll dull the edge." She didn't argue, just adjusted her next strike. The result was better. "I'll take the heavier logs," he added. "You're burning strength too fast." She paused, finally looked up. There was sweat at her hairline despite the cold. "I can manage." He nodded once and didn't press. Instead, he hauled a fresh pile from the woodshed, stacked it by the door, and headed toward the chicken pen. One hen had frozen overnight, likely from a crack in the coop wall. He scooped it up, gutted it by the fence, and set the meat aside for boiling. By noon, the three of them had settled into a rhythm without discussion. Nara repaired the roof line over the porch. Taya stayed inside, mending seams along the cabin curtains with a tight stitch. Micah worked the fence rail along the north slope, where snow had pushed one of the posts out of line. Inside, the cabin smelled of broth and pine smoke. The chicken simmered in a pot near the hearth. Taya added dried root and pinch of salt without asking. When Micah returned, the food was hot. She handed him a bowl with both hands, eyes down. He sat at the table and ate quietly. "You cook," he said between bites. Taya nodded. "My mother taught me before she passed." "How long ago?" "4 winters." Micah didn't ask what happened after that. Instead, he said, "Good salt balance." That earned him the faintest smile. Not much, but it stayed for longer than he expected. Later, while Nara repaired the front step, she called him out with a quiet urgency in her tone. He came to the porch. She pointed at the ridge line across the clearing. 3 riders, she said flatly. He squinted. Distant, near the tree lean. Moving slow. "Don't look like trappers," he muttered. "No." He studied their approach. They weren't arm high. No rifles showing. They weren't riding hard either, just coasting the edge of the valley, too far to make out faces. After a few minutes, they turned east, heading toward the far slope. "Looking for something," Micah said. Nara stepped back. "Or someone." He didn't reply. They said nothing about it to Taya. That night, he added extra wood to the stove, locked the door, and placed a second rifle near the windowsill. He didn't speak about it. Neither did they. After dinner, Nara asked quietly, "If someone comes here asking questions, what would you say?" Micah leaned against the wall near the fire, arms folded. "Depends who's asking." She didn't press further. Taya laid out the bedding again. 3 spaces now, one near the stove, one against the wall, and one under the rear window. No one said goodnight, but no one stayed awake either. Micah watched them both fall asleep from the corner of the room, then listened for another hour. There were no more sounds outside, just wind against the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote crying out once before falling silent. He didn't know who those riders were, but the women weren't the only ones being hunted, and he wasn't ready to lose what little steadiness had returned to his life. The next morning came colder than any before. The glass in the windows cracked from the pressure change overnight, thin white lines spidering out from the corners. When Micah stepped outside, the wind caught his coat open and bit through his shirt like it had teeth. He didn't curse, just pulled the collar higher and limped toward the well. The rope had frozen stiff. He wrapped it twice around his hand and forced the bucket down with slow, grinding effort. Every muscle in his back tightened. When it would finally hit water, the sound was dull, like a slap inside a cave. He hauled it up, breathing harder than he wanted. Inside, Taya was already near the fire. She'd taken to waking before him now. Not out of habit, but something deeper. The kind of readiness people learn when they've been left too many times. She didn't sit close to the heat, just close enough. She was brushing her hair slowly, the braid half finished, her fingers moving with care. No one had taught her to do it fancy, just tight enough to keep the wind out. Micah handed her the water without comment. She nodded and carried it to the stove. Nara came in through the back door, carrying a brace of dead rabbits, shot clean, heads intact. She'd taken his small rifle without asking, which told him something. When she laid them on the counter, she finally met his eyes. "They were near the tree line," she said. "Easy to track." "Too easy." Micah checked the meat. "Think someone drove them in?" She gave a short shrug. "Could be." The rest of the day unfolded in tight, separate loops. Nara spent it boiling hides out back, setting up a crude drying frame behind the barn. Her movements were sharp, practiced. She'd done this before, more than once. Micah didn't ask when or where. Taya stayed indoors. She cleaned the shelves, sorted the jars of preserved beans and dried apples, found a cracked tin of coffee that had gone bitter. She threw it out without asking. Micah spent the hours between the tool shed and the southern ridge, checking his trap line and resetting 3 of the older steel jaws deeper along the canyon. On the way back, he found fresh boot tracks. Wide-soled, heavy heel. Not his. They were from that morning. He bent down, checked the edges. No snow had fallen since before dawn. The print was sharp, undisturbed. Recent. When he reached the cabin again, Nara was already inside, warming her hands near the stovetop. Taya sat with a small piece of cloth in her lap, threading new beads into a simple shape, round and concentric, colors he didn't recognize. He dropped the pack of traps by the door. "Someone was close," he said. Nara straightened. "How close?" "North slope. Half a mile." She exchanged a glance with her sister. "They following you?" he asked plainly. "We left no one behind," Nara said, but her tone lacked certainty. Micah leaned against the doorway. "They left prints. That means they wanted them seen." Taya didn't speak. Her hands paused over the cloth, then resumed. He didn't light the lamp that night, just the fire. They sat in its glow, shadows flickering long and slow on the walls. "You planning to move on soon?" he asked, looking toward Nara. Her posture didn't shift. "You want us gone?" "No." Taya looked up at that. Nara asked, then why ask? "Because if someone comes for you and I'm standing in front, I ought to know why." There was a long pause. Nara replied with something close to honesty. "We weren't running from men. We were cast out, for leaving too many graves behind." Micah didn't push for names. After a while, Taya stood, stepped closer to the fire, and unfolded the cloth she'd been working on. It was simple, just a band of colors stitched into a loop. She placed it on the table near him, didn't say a word. Micah looked at it for a long moment before resting his hand over the edge of the fabric. That night, no one said goodnight. The wind stayed quiet, but no one trusted it. And for the first time since they'd arrived, all three slept light. The next morning came colder than any before. The glass in the windows cracked from the pressure change overnight, thin white lines spidering out from the corners. When Micah stepped outside, the wind caught his coat open and bit through his shirt like it had teeth. He didn't curse, just pulled the collar higher and limped toward the well. The rope had frozen stiff. He wrapped it twice around his hand and forced the bucket down with slow, grinding effort. Every muscle in his back tightened. When it would finally hit water, the sound was dull, like a slap inside a cave. He hauled it up, breathing harder than he wanted. Inside, Taya was already near the fire. She'd taken to waking before him now. Not out of habit, but something deeper. The kind of readiness people learn when they've been left too many times. She didn't sit close to the heat, just close enough. She was brushing her hair slowly, the braid half finished, her fingers moving with care. No one had taught her to do it fancy, just tight enough to keep the wind out. Micah handed her the water without comment. She nodded and carried it to the stove. Nara came in through the back door carrying a brace of dead rabbits, shot clean, heads intact. She'd taken his small rifle without asking, which told him something. When she laid them on the counter, she finally met his eyes. They were near the tree line, she said. Easy to track. Too easy. Micah checked the meat. Think someone drove them in? She gave a short shrug. Could be. The rest of the day unfolded in tight, separate loops. Nara spent it boiling hides out back, setting up a crude drying frame behind the barn. Her movements were sharp, practiced. She'd done this before, more than once. Micah didn't ask when or where. Taya stayed indoors. She cleaned the shelves, sorted the jars of preserved beans and dried apples, found a cracked tin of coffee that had gone bitter. She threw it out without asking. Micah spent the hours between the tool shed and the southern ridge, checking his trap line and resetting 3 of the older steel jaws deeper along the canyon. On the way back, he found fresh boot tracks. Wide-soled, heavy heel. Not his. They were from that morning. He bent down, checked the edges. No snow had fallen since before dawn. The print was sharp, undisturbed, recent. When he reached the cabin again, Nara was already inside, warming her hands near the stovetop. Taya sat with a small piece of cloth in her lap, threading new beads into a simple shape, round and concentric, colors he didn't recognize. He dropped the pack of traps by the door. Someone was close, he said. Nara straightened. How close? North slope. Half a mile. She exchanged a glance with her sister. They following you? He asked plainly. We left no one behind, Nara said, but her tone lacked certainty. Micah leaned against the doorway. They left prints. That means they wanted them seen. Taya didn't speak. Her hands paused over the cloth, then resumed. He didn't light the lamp that night. Just a fire. They sat in its glow, shadows flickering long and slow on the walls. You planning to move on soon? He asked, looking toward Nara. Her posture didn't shift. You want us gone? No. Taya looked up at that. Nara asked, then why ask? Because if someone comes for you and I'm standing in front, I ought to know why. There was a long pause. Nara replied with something close to honesty. We weren't running from men. We were cast out for leaving too many graves behind. Micah didn't push for names. After a while, Taya stood, stepped closer to the fire, and unfolded the cloth she'd been working on. It was simple, just a band of colors stitched into a loop. She placed it on the table near him. Didn't say a word. Micah looked at it for a long moment before resting his hand over the edge of the fabric. That night, no one said goodnight. The wind stayed quiet, but no one trusted it. And for the first time since they'd arrived, all 3 slept light. The snow stopped overnight, but the stillness it left behind stayed in the air like it was waiting. The kind of quiet that made men listen harder, not because something was wrong, but because something might be. Micah left before sunup, saddled the mare by lantern, packed jerky, a blanket, and a small rifle. He didn't announce it, just nodded once toward Nara and shut the door behind him. The ground had hardened under the cold again. Snow crunched different when it iced over, the weight more brittle, less forgiving. He rode west, toward the ridgeline where the tracks had appeared. The sky was just beginning to turn a faint gray blue. A crow passed overhead, silent. Back at the cabin, Nara sharpened the hatchet by the window. She didn't check on Taya. She didn't need to. Her sister was outside by then, sweeping the snow from the front steps with short, careful strokes. Neither spoke. The hours passed without incident. Nara mended the porch railing. Taya boiled the last of the dried corn, added the wild sage Micah kept in a jar labeled only with a red X. They didn't eat until mid-afternoon, and when they did, they sat across from one another at the table, chewing in rhythm, eyes on their bowls. Then the mare returned. Alone. Taya saw it first. She dropped the pot she'd been drying and ran barefoot across the snow-packed yard. The horse wasn't panicked, just slow, saddlebags intact, no sign of blood, but no rider. Nara came out behind her, took one look, turned back inside, grabbed the second rifle, and checked the load. 5 rounds, one in the chamber. She strapped the knife to her hip and faced the tree lean. "What do we do?" Taya asked, breath sharp. Nara's jaw flexed. "Nothing stupid." By sundown, Micah still hadn't returned. They stayed near the cabin. Doors bolted, rifle resting across the table. Taya paced. Nara didn't move much. She kept to the shadows by the window, watching the edge of the woods. When the fire burned low, Taya whispered, "What if he didn't mean to come back?" Nara answered without turning. "He would have taken his coat." That silence held until the first knock. Not loud, just 3 slow raps on the outer door. Both women froze. The latch stayed still. Nara raised the rifle. Then the knock came again, slower, heavier. Taya stepped backward until her back hit the shelf. Her hand found the edge of the fire iron. Then a voice came through the wood. Dry, grit-filled. "It's me." Nara lowered the rifle, but her eyes didn't relax. She opened the door half an inch. Micah stood there, leaning hard on one leg, snow soaked up to his knees. His face was flushed with cold, a fresh cut on his left cheek, blood frozen into the beard. He looked at Nara. Didn't expect company. She opened the door fully. He stepped inside, breathing shallow, coat stiff as bark. Taya closed it behind him fast. Micah walked to the fire without speaking and dropped onto the stool. "They were watching from the bluff," he said after a moment. Didn't engage. Just stood there. 5 of them. One had a spyglass. Looked like they were waiting on someone. He unbuttoned his coat slowly, then reached for the kettle, pouring water into the cup Nara held out. "You all right?" she asked low. He gave a short nod. "Didn't think I'd get turned around, but the snow covered everything east. Took the long way back." No one asked why they hadn't helped. No one blamed the silence. Later that night, when the coals were dying down and the moon sent pale light through the slats in the wall, Micah said, without looking at either of them, "They'll come down soon. When they do, I need to know if you're staying." Taya looked at her sister. Nara looked at the fire. Neither answered. Not yet. Micah's coat still hung by the stove when morning came. Damp steam curled off the sleeves, rising into the cabin's rafters like the memory of the storm he'd walked through the day before. He hadn't changed clothes, hadn't spoken after the last thing he said the night before. He just sat, back to the wall, one boot off, left ankle wrapped in a torn strip of wool. The cut across his cheek had started to bruise under the eye. Taya moved first. She took the kettle from its hook, refilled it from the bucket, and started heating the water without waiting to be asked. She didn't say anything, just worked the fire until it cooperated. The flames rose higher and caught. Light danced across the floorboards, catching on the rifle still resting near the table. Nara hadn't slept either. She sat in the corner, sharpening the small knife on a piece of whetstone Micah had handed her before sunset. Her hand moved slow, careful, each pass even and deliberate. She hadn't spoken since she'd told Taya to stay close to the door. No one brought up the figures on the bluff. No one mentioned the 5 men with the spyglass. But each one of them knew time had changed. Micah finally stood just after daybreak, his limp more pronounced, the ankle clearly swelling inside the boot. He didn't ask for help, just braced against the wall, pulled on the coat, and looked out through the slit in the shutters toward the hills. "Fresh sign out past the ridge," he muttered. "Someone's been walking the creek." "Alone?" Taya asked. "Same men as before." Micah didn't answer. He unlatched the small chest beneath his bedroll and pulled out a second revolver. He checked the chamber, loaded 3 rounds, then offered it to Nara without comment. She took it with both hands and didn't hesitate. "We hold here," he said. "No reason to run." Taya's fingers curled tighter around the mug she was holding. "Why not leave now?" Micah looked at her, not unkindly. "Because if they're watching, they know every path out. They'll be expecting fear." She swallowed hard. "And we're not afraid? Not enough to scatter." The rest of the day unfolded with unease buried under routine. Taya ground dried corn with a stone bowl. Nara cleaned the spilled oil near the shelf, repacked the jerky tins, and nailed a scrap of hide across the cracked back window. Micah spent most of the afternoon seated on the stool outside the door, rifle across his lap, a pair of binoculars slung around his neck. He barely moved. The wind picked up in intervals. No new tracks appeared. At one point, Nara stepped outside and leaned against the wall near him. She didn't look at him. "You think they'll come before night?" she asked. He shook his head once. "If they come, it'll be near dusk." "That's what I thought." He studied her face. Her jaw was tight, lips chapped. She looked worn, but not weak. "You done this before?" "I've waited on men with weapons before. That's not the same as being ready." He nodded. Later, Taya brought him a strip of cloth soaked in boiled sage water. "For the swelling," she said, kneeling without meeting his eyes. He let her place it over his ankle. Her hands were smaller than he'd expected. "Cold from basin." "Thanks," he muttered. She stood, wiped her fingers dry, and walked away without replying. Evening settled in fast. The air turned sharper, more bitter. The snow hadn't returned, but the frost crept down the glass like fingers pressing in from the outside. Shadows stretched long across the yard. Then the dog started barking. Micah stood. Fast. Too fast for the ankle. He braced his hand against the wall and gritted through it. Nara already had the rifle in her grip, pointed toward the south window. Taya froze in the kitchen, one hand hovering over a pot. Micah's voice was low. "Stay inside. Lock the back." He stepped onto the porch just as the first shape emerged past the far fence. A rider. Slow. No rifle out. Just holding the reins with one hand, the other lifted slightly, palm empty. Micah kept his rifle low, but ready. The man stopped just short of the fire pit ring. Dismounted without speaking. He looked Apache. Younger than Micah, maybe early 30s. Wore a buffalo hide coat and a beaded sash across his chest. The man raised both hands halfway. "You sheltered our blood," he said evenly. Micah didn't answer. "They are not yours," the man continued. "But you took them in, fed them, covered them with warmth." "Is that true?" Micah replied without blinking. "They were dying. I don't watch people freeze." The man nodded once, eyes unreadable. "Our honor was damaged when they were cast out. Your action changes what happens next." Micah frowned. "You plan to take them?" "No, but you must decide." Behind Micah, Nara had stepped just inside the doorway. She held the rifle angled down, but her face was locked tight. "You speak of honor," she said to the man. "What about choice?" The man looked at her. "There is choice. That is why we came on foot. No weapons raised." He stepped back 2 paces. "Our circle waits beyond the trees. If the man chooses one of you," he glanced between Nara and the cabin behind her, "or both, we bear witness. If he says no, he must return what does not belong." Micah didn't move. He didn't look at Nara. He didn't look toward the cabin. He just breathed in once, chest rising, eyes steady, hands loose. "I already built room for them," he said quietly. "I don't send people back into the cold after I feed them." The man stared at him for a long second, then gave a shallow nod. "Then we'll come tomorrow. With the circle. At dusk." And without another word, he mounted and turned, disappearing into the growing dark. No one spoke, once the rider vanished into the dark. Micah didn't return inside right away. He stood on the porch for a while, staring into the trees where the man had disappeared, jaw set tight, fingers flexing once around the edge of the doorway. The wind had dropped again, leaving behind a stillness that didn't feel like peace. It felt like the space before a storm you couldn't name. Inside the cabin, Taya moved slowly as she cleared the table. The bowl she carried slipped once against her palm, but didn't fall. She placed it down gently, adjusted the spoon beside it, then turned and began washing without being asked. Nara sat near the fire, legs crossed, the rifle propped beside her. She wasn't holding it anymore, but it rested close. Her hands were clasped loosely in her lap, and though her eyes faced the flame, her attention wasn't there. She was somewhere else, calculating, weighing, waiting. Micah came in after another 5 minutes. He unhooked his coat, draped it over the back of the nearest chair, and moved toward the stove with a stiffness that came not from cold, but from exhaustion threaded into the bone. He poured himself water, took a slow sip, then sat without a word. "I heard," Nara said quietly. He nodded once. Taya glanced between them, her brow tense. "Are they going to force anything?" "No," Micah said, "but they expect a decision." Nara shifted. "What kind of decision?" Micah looked at her now. Direct. Steady. They want a formal. Not just shelter. Not just kindness. They want you to marry one of you. Maybe both. The room didn't go quiet. It already was. But something shifted. Taya stared at him, wide-eyed. She didn't speak. Her mouth opened, then shut again. Nara's voice was flat. So, this wasn't about gratitude. This was about making it right by their law. They see it as restoring dignity, Micah said. And you? Nara asked. What do you see? Micah didn't answer right away. He stood again, walked toward the window, looked out into the frozen dark where nothing moved. When I brought you in, I didn't know what would follow, he said. Didn't care. You were cold. You were half dead. That's all I needed. And now? Nara pressed, but her tone held no challenge. Just necessity. He turned toward her. You've been here a week. You fixed what I hadn't touched in months. You cooked. You hunted. You held quiet like it meant something. I got used to waking up and not being alone. He paused, looked toward Taya now. You smiled 2 days ago. Just once. I hadn't seen that in years. Not in anyone. Taya's face flushed. She lowered her gaze and wrapped her shawl tighter. Nara stood, crossed the room slowly until she stood by the stove. Her arms folded, voice even. You didn't ask for us. You didn't expect us. And now your life's been rewritten without your consent. He shook his head. No, it's been steadied. The fire cracked once behind them. I'm not asking for anything, he added. They are. But I won't lie to them. I won't lie to you. Taya stepped forward now. What if we don't want it? You can walk, he said plainly. I won't stop you. But they will. Not with violence. With exile. Again, Nara spoke before her sister could. We're not leaving. Taya looked up at her sharply. You're certain? Nara's voice didn't shake. There's nothing for us past those trees. Here, we're fed. We're heard. We're treated like people. Micah studied her, waiting. She faced him directly. So who do you choose? He exhaled slowly. That's not something I can say like picking a side of the table. Nara's brow creased. But they'll ask. I'll answer, he said. But not with names. With how I live. She didn't ask what that meant. Instead, she walked past him, picked up the extra rifle, checked the rounds, and set it near the door. Then we prepare, she said. They didn't sleep. Not one of them. Nara stayed outside most of the night, pacing the porch, watching the distant rise where the bluff caught moonlight. Taya sat by the fire, sewing a new edge into one of Micah's spare shirts without comment, her lips pressed in concentration. Micah stood at the table sharpening both his blades, eyes unfocused, mind elsewhere. He wasn't planning for violence. He was preparing for something harder. Being seen. At some point before dawn, Nara returned inside, cheeks red from cold. She met his eyes and spoke low. We'll stand beside you. Whatever they ask. Taya stood behind her, fingers clenched in the hem of the shirt she held. Even if it means sharing? Nara didn't answer. Micah did. That's not for them to decide. The sun rose without color. Just light. The sky turned bone white before midday. Wind picked up again, not enough to scatter snow, but strong enough to move the trees in slow groans. By noon, the horizon wasn't empty anymore. Shapes emerged. First 6, then 12, then more. Riders, men on foot, a few women. All Apache, all silent. Their presence spread like a slow tide, fanning out from the tree line across the edge of the property until they stood in a wide arc, their half-circle closing in, respectful but unmistakable. They didn't shout. They didn't raise weapons. They simply arrived and waited. Micah had cleared the yard an hour earlier, shoveling the snow back from the porch, making space not just to stand, but to be seen. His coat was buttoned tight, rifle set aside on purpose. His ankle was bound better today, wrapped with clean cloth. Pain was still there, but he wouldn't show it. Not now. Nara and Taya stood behind him, dressed in clean deerskin they had brushed and stitched that morning. Nara wore the same flannel shirt beneath her wrap, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Taya had her hair tied with blue thread. No jewelry, no war paint, just plain dignity. An elder stepped forward from the group, tall, gray braids, a buffalo hide draped across his shoulders, trimmed with crow feathers. He stood directly across from Micah and studied him for several long seconds. "You gave shelter," the elder said. His voice was deep, measured. "You tended wounds. You shared food. This is not small." Micah didn't interrupt. "You were not asked to offer anything. Yet you gave it." He nodded once. "They were cold. I had heat." The elder's gaze didn't waver. "Now you must speak. For the sake of their standing, and for your own. Do you send them back to us? But do you name them as yours?" Micah looked at Nara first. She didn't blink. Her eyes locked on his. Behind her, Taya stood with both hands clasped in front of her waist. She wasn't trembling. He took a moment before he spoke. "I don't know your customs well," Micah said evenly. "I've seen law used to chain people. I've seen it used to free them. I won't pretend to understand which this is." The elder waited. "But I know this much," Micah continued. "In this place, with my name, I decide who stays, who eats at my table, who sleeps under my roof. These women," he looked toward the sisters, then faced the circle again. "They've worked beside me. They've asked for nothing they didn't earn. I didn't bring them in to own them. I brought them in because no one should freeze. I kept them here because no one else had." Now, he stepped forward, not with threat, but with clarity. "So if you're asking if I claim them to protect your tradition, I don't." A quiet murmur rippled through the gathered watchers. Micah held steady. "I don't claim people. I live beside them, and they chose to stay." The elder looked to Nara. She stepped forward calmly, one pace beside Micah. "I speak my own voice," she said. "We were cast aside." He opened his door. That was not weakness. That was strength. Then Taya stepped up as well, her chin raised. "I didn't ask to belong here, but I want to." The elder turned back to Micah. "You offer no ceremony?" Micah shook his head. "I offer something better. Permanence." A long pause followed. Then the elder looked toward the circle, gave a short nod. One by one, the men and women began to lower their heads slightly. A gesture, not submission, acknowledgement. Then the half-circle broke apart. Some mounted, others turned to walk. No one lingered. No more questions were asked. Within minutes, the yard was empty again. Micah stood still until the last figure disappeared over the ridge. Then he let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest for too long. Nara looked up at him. "You didn't answer them with a name." "No," he said. "Didn't feel right to." Taya touched the back of his sleeve. "But you answered them." He looked at both women, then turned and walked toward the cabin. Inside, the fire still glowed in the stove. He added 2 logs, adjusted the kettle. Nara took a seat by the wall, untying her hair slowly. Taya leaned against the window frame, watching the light shift through the cracks. Micah pulled a chair toward the table and sat. "I've got space on the north side," he said, "for another room. If we build it right, it'll hold heat better than this one." Nara smiled faintly. "We'll start clearing it tomorrow." Taya stepped over and placed the sewn cloth she'd been working on into his hand. A simple design. 3 birds stitched into rough wool. Different colors, all flying in the same direction. Micah didn't say anything, just folded it carefully and placed it on the table. That night, they didn't talk about what happened. They didn't plan the future out loud. But Taya sat near the fire and rested her head against Micah's knee without asking. And Nara took down the empty cup beside him, filled it, and brought it back. When the last lantern was turned low and the room sank into warmth and shadow, no one slept apart anymore. And for the first time in years, Micah Shaw didn't fall asleep alone. He didn't carry anyone. He wasn't owed. He just stayed, and they stayed with him.